Hey everyone, welcome back for some more standard content here on MTG Arena. And today I'm showcasing a color combination that really feels like it's kind of skyrocketed in popularity, at least for over the past couple weeks or so. This is Simic. So there's a few versions of this deck. There's like an aggro build, and there's kind of a mid-range build. I am just calling this Simic counters because that's kind of what this deck does, is it puts +1/+1 counters on your creatures. So in my last video, I went through and tried to make a Gruul aggro deck that was using Ouroboroid, which is one of my favorite cards from Edge of Eternities. Admittedly, after that video, I just wanted to keep building with Ouroboroid. I really like this card, and I wanted to try my own attempt at this Simic build. Simic actually feels like a pretty friendly brew combination right now because you have all the dual lands that you could possibly need. There's a Verge, there's a Shock land, and a Fast land, similar to Orzhov in that manner. Normally when I'm brewing with a deck, I'll make separate versions, like I'll actually make a copy of the deck and make a different version. So that way when I go to Untapped, I can see how each different version is performing. I actually decided not to really do that with this deck because really the first version I had was performing really well. And then the next version that I had was also performing pretty well. The next version I did was performing really well. So I just kept it all on this one copy of the deck. And you can see the record here. It's surprisingly good. It's not quite as high performing as some of the other decks that I've showcased, but this is still really impressive. I was actually very surprised with how well this deck was doing. So I'm going to structure this video in a different way than I normally do. I'm going to showcase some of the different versions that I've tried with this deck. There's been probably at least 5 different versions that I've been doing, but I'm going to show you 3. I'm going to show you 3 that felt pretty good, and then I'm going to show you a match for each version of the deck. I was a little bit worried about how long this video might end up being, so I decided to show you 3 versions and 1 match for each version. One of the critiques that I mentioned in my previous video about the Simic build with Ouroboroid is that it sometimes has difficulty getting damage through. You have these big creatures that have like 10 power or something like that, but your opponent just blocks with a 1/1, and now that 10 power isn't really doing anything. So what I've attempted with these different versions is to incorporate either more flying or more trample, or to try to kind of do some combination of both. So let me start with this version first in front of you, which takes more of a flying approach. First card I'll talk about is Spyglass Siren. This is an excellent 1-drop in a number of creature-based decks that have blue. Really good in this deck, not only for the flying, but the map token, because the map token can potentially be used to buff Ouroboroid, which is of course going to give you more counters on all of your creatures. I honestly think that Spyglass Siren is such a good 1-drop for this deck that no matter which version of it you're running, you're probably going to want 4 copies of it, at least to start in the main deck before you sideboard. Next up is a card that is not featured in a lot of deck lists, but I think is being very slept on, which is Gene Pollinator. This card is really good in this deck. For one thing, if you play a Spyglass Siren, that map token can now tap you for mana, and you don't have to sacrifice it to do that. This is a really nice combination, starting with a Spyglass Siren, getting your map token, and now if you play a Gene Pollinator, you technically have 4 mana by your 3rd turn or 5 mana by your 4th turn, etc, etc. There's a couple other things that you can tap for mana that I'm going to talk about in a little bit, but really I think that this card performed better than expected, especially in this version of the deck. Next up is of course Llanowar Elves. This is no surprise, you'll probably want to run 4 copies of Llanowar Elves, and no matter which version of this deck that you run, it allows you to get Ouroboroid on the field a turn earlier, or it allows you to play Ouroboroid while you can still hold up a counter spell or something like that. If you run 2 copies of Gene Pollinator, then you might not necessarily need to run the 4 copies of Llanowar Elves. You could potentially put something else here, like a Paw Patch Recruit or even a Hemosymbic Might. Next up is a card that appears in a lot of these deck lists, which is Floodpit's Drowner. So Floodpit's Drowner fits pretty nicely in this deck because if you can tap down an opponent's creature, then you can seemingly attack. And if you have these really big creatures, then you can get in for lots of damage, right? But the Floodpit's Drowner actually has a bit of depth in this deck. For one thing, if you're buffing this Floodpit's Drowner with your Ouroboroid, then this is going to be a big creature when it attacks, but it has vigilance, so then it is also a big blocker. That's really good because one of the drawbacks of Floodpit's Drowner is that it only has 1 toughness, but if you're buffing it with Ouroboroid, well now this is a very valuable creature. It's going to tap down one of your opponent's creature and put a stun counter on it. But in this version it does go a bit deeper because if it has Vigilance, it never taps, right? Which means that you can tap it with Gene Pollinator for an extra piece of mana at any time. It's really good. Vigilance is very strong with Gene Pollinator. That's actually something to keep in mind for any other decks that you want to brew that utilize Gene Pollinator, is try to find creatures with Vigilance. Next up are a few cards that are not really featured in a lot of these deck lists, so the first one being Plumecreed Escort. I'm actually a little bit surprised that more of these Simic decks are not running copies of Plumecreed Escort. These creatures that you play in this deck are pretty valuable, so being able to protect one of them with Hexproof, whether that's Ouroboroid or Curiosity or whatever, that seems pretty valuable. But it's also a flyer, and again, flying is pretty important because you need to be able to get in for that damage once you start putting counters on everything, right? I think that Plumecreed in general has just been very slept on for a while. I didn't see it in a lot of decks before rotation. I haven't really seen it in many decks after rotation. The only exception being, I guess, the Birds deck, like the Bant Birds. But this card is really good, man. You get a 2/1 flyer that you can flash in, give something hexproof for only 2 mana. I think more creature-based decks need to be running a couple copies of this card. Next up is Innkeeper's Talents. So this card works extremely well when you have Gene Pollinator in the deck as well, because this is a permanent that you can tap for mana. It's just an enchantment. You can tap it whenever. So this is now not only giving +1/+1 counters on all your creatures and everything else, it can also be tapped as a mana source. There is a combo here with Innkeeper's Talent, which is you can put a ++1 counter on Ouroboroid before it actually triggers. So you can order your triggers so that this happens first, which means that now there's going to be more counters put on all of your creatures because Ouroboroid has a higher power before this trigger actually happens. That being said, even though it's a really good combination, I do kind of feel like without the Gene Pollinator, it's not quite as useful because it is still a little bit slow. You would rather play a creature on turn 2 than Innkeeper's Talent. And for that matter, you'd probably rather play a creature on turn 3 as well instead of Innkeeper's Talent. It's still really good and it performs very well in this version of the deck. Last of the 2 drops is Gene Morth Imago. This card fits really well in this deck. It has flying, it's the Simic colors, only 2 mana for a 1/3, but then you get this landfall trigger to give a creature base power and toughness 3/3, or if you control 6 lands, it's going to be a 6/6. So if you play Ouroboroid while this is on the field, well, if you can play it before you've played your land, then you can play your land, and now this is going to be a 3/3 creature, which means everything's going to get 3 ++1 counters. It's a really strong combination, but it's also just good for a Floodpit's Drowner. It's good for a Siren, right? It's good for even a Llanowar Elves. It allows you to potentially attack for some more power. That being said, most of these Simic lists are running 4 copies of this. I didn't like running 4 copies of it. For one thing, it is only 1 power for 2 mana. The Floodpit's Drowner, the Plumecreed, these have 2 power for 2 mana. Now, the 3 toughness is really good. It can block a lot of flyers, especially like Deep Cavern Bat or an opponent's Spyglass Siren, or like even a Nurturing Pixie and all that stuff, or some Pearl Kieran. And not only that, to my surprise, really, because again, Simic is one of the most brew-friendly color combinations with all these dual lands, but I was having some trouble casting it. It sounds absurd, but it's true. I was having some trouble casting it where I'd have 1 or 2 copies of this thing in my hand and I couldn't put it on the field on the turn that I wanted to put it. So I do think that 4 copies is too much. I think at most you're going to want to do 3, and then you'll get the value that you want. Maybe cut a Plumecreed and only run 1 copy of that. Maybe cut a Floodpit's Drowner, do 3 of that and 3 of this. That could be a potential good distribution of these cards. Moving on to 3 drops. So first one is another one that is not featured in a lot of decks, which is the Kitesail Larcenist. One of the drawbacks of this Simic build is that it doesn't have a lot of good interaction. There's some interaction, but it's not great. But this pirate right here is a way that you can interact with your opponent's stuff. 2/3 flyer for 3 mana that has Ward 1. That's already pretty decent, but then you get to choose an artifact or creature that the opponent controls, and that thing becomes a treasure token, at least for as long as Larcenist is on the battlefield. For what it's worth, you could also choose one of your things, but I find it surprising that you can want to do that unless you're really desperate for mana. So if your opponent has like a Breacher or a Sephiroth or a Cosmogran Zenith or an Ouroboroid or whatever, you know, the creature is that is kind of threatening, then you can just turn it into a treasure token. It is a considerable trade-off because technically you are giving them an extra piece of mana, but for them to use that mana, they have to sacrifice seemingly one of their best creatures. That's usually a fairly favorable trade. The main thing here is that it's another flyer. It's another flyer that also allows you to interact with your opponent's stuff because, again, that's kind of a limiting factor to this Simic build. Next one is Sentinel of the Nameless City. So this one does get featured in some of these deck lists, and in this one it's really good because of the Vigilance. And again, Vigilance allows you to tap it for Gene Pollinator in addition to making the map tokens. So those are more permanent, so you can tap for Gene Pollinator. These two cards are so freaking good together. If you're going to build a deck that uses Gene Pollinator, I strongly recommend that you run copies of Sentinel of the Nameless City in there. The map tokens, you can tap for mana, you can tap the Sentinel itself for mana. But in this deck, in addition to the extra mana, you can potentially use that map token to put another counter on Ouroboroid. That's, again, one of the big benefits of having Spyglass Siren in the deck, but now you have Sentinel of the Nameless City, which also makes map tokens. In addition to that, like I was saying for Floodpitch Drowner with the Vigilance, now you not only have a really strong attacker, but you also have a really strong blocker. Very good against aggressive decks, and to that end, you know, maybe even if you don't run it in the main deck, you might want a couple copies of this in the sideboard. Now we're getting to the two heavy hitters, the two best creatures in this deck, Enduring Curiosity and Ouroboroid. So Enduring Curiosity is one of the best cards in Standard right now. It draws you cards, and that's really important for this deck because you are going to potentially play something every single turn, so you're going to run out of cards. But again, this is why the flying is important, not only to do the damage to your opponent to actually get them down to no life, but also to be able to draw cards off Curiosity. I haven't seen a deck list that runs 4 copies of Curiosity, and honestly, you're not going to want to because Ouroboroid is just better in this deck. So, but running 2-3 copies, that tends to feel pretty good. For what it's worth, the Curiosity isn't quite as important if you have the Sentinel Nameless City and you have the Spyglass Siren, because the map tokens do help you look through the deck a little bit. And of course, Ouroboroid is just busted. Now, there are a few things with this though. One is that this card is absolutely a lightning rod. As soon as your opponent sees it, they're gonna do everything they can to get rid of it. So you can't always expect that this creature is going to survive. So you do need a plan. You need to find ways to kind of draw out removal spells if possible. Draw out removal spells with your Sentinel, or draw out removal spells with your Larcenist, your Imago, whatever. Anything that you can do to draw out removal spells before Ouroboroid comes down. Additionally, you might need to be a little bit patient with this card because you want a wide board before you play it. So you might need to wait a turn if it means you can get another Floodpitch Drowner down, or you can get another Spyglass Siren down, because the wider your board is, the more value this Ouroboroid brings. Now, I already mentioned a little combo here with Innkeeper's Talent, but there's another thing with this, which is that obviously Ouroboroid puts counters on all your creatures, and the second level of Innkeeper's Talent gives your permanents Ward. Now all of your creatures have Ward 1. It's pretty good. Innkeeper's Talent performed very well in this version of the deck, and really, even when Ouroboroid got removed, sometimes I would just win off the Innkeeper's Talent. Moving on to the little bit of interaction that we have in this deck. So there's obviously Into the Floodmaw. I don't think running 4 copies of Into the Floodmaw is really that valuable because you don't really get rid of the thing. The thing just comes back, and really against mono red or any of those aggro decks, it doesn't really matter. The thing just comes back and then it has haste anyway. The best use of Into the Floodmaw is to like tap down an opponent's creature with a Floodpitch Drowner or something, and then remove their one blocker that they have left, and then just swing for tons of damage with Ouroboroid. It is flexible in that it can remove any permanent if you just gift a Tap Fish. And Tap Fish is not so bad because you may be able to remove whatever that permanent is and then swing for tons of damage if the fish is tapped. One of the best options that we have in Simic colors to interact, but really, again, I don't think 4 copies is really worth it. 2 copies of Bushwhack. This is, again, another way to interact. It can potentially find you that land that you're missing, but a lot of the time you're going to want to use it as a fight spell. Works pretty well in that regard. I do prefer this compared to some of the instant speed fight spells or something like Hard Hitting Question, even though Hard Hitting Question just does damage. Having the flexibility to be able to find that land, it really does make a difference. That being said, I really don't think you run more than 2 copies of it in this deck, because sometimes you just can't actually kill the opponent's creature by fighting it, or if it's like a screaming nemesis and you don't want to fight that anyway sometimes. Leaving room for some other piece of interaction feels better than just running several copies of this. Lastly, Repulsive Mutation. So this card does work pretty well in this deck. You can potentially put a ++1 counter on Ouroboroid, and now it has higher power, and then you're probably going to be able to counter whatever that spell is that your opponent plays. That being said, this card did slightly underperform for me because you need a creature on the battlefield for it to work. And sometimes you just don't, or all you got is like a Spyglass Siren or Gene Pollinator or Land of Worlds. You just have something with 1 power and you can only tap this for 2 mana, and then your opponent only has to tap for 1, and then they can still play their thing. I do still think it works pretty well in this deck, but I severely doubt you want to run more than 2 copies, and to that end you might only want to run like 1 and try like a different counter spell or something like that. I'll round out the main deck by discussing the lands. Again, very friendly. You got Botanical Statement, Breeding Pool, the Willow Rustfords. I don't think there's any reason to not run 4 copies of each. I'm personally running 1 copy of Heads Mage. I do get some value from it. That Surveil really does make a difference sometimes, but also it is a way to turn on the Verge if you don't have a basic land type. Speaking of that, I'm running 8 basic lands here, and you could potentially, you know, run a little bit less, but I feel like it's not really too necessary to kind of fill this out with more non-basic lands. This kind of feels like it does the job, and since I have 6 1-drops that are green and Ouroboroid's double green, it's the most valuable card, then I'm running 1 more forest and island. But if you actually look at the mana cost, it's slightly more blue, but I found that it didn't really impede me too much. Again, really the only issue I was having was being able to consistently cast the Gene Morph Imago on turn 2 if I wanted to. There's also the aspect that the Verge does start blue, so to that end, having 1 extra forest does kind of balance that out. There's also the possibility of just trimming one of these forests, doing like 3 and 4, and then running one of these other kinds of lands. Then I just have a few creatures lands in here, Restless Vinestock of course, but I think that this is probably the worst out of all the Restless lands because, well, maybe the Restless, what is it, the Restless Pyre or something like that, or the Restless Spire, that one's pretty bad. Or the Restless Vents, that one's also a little bit underwhelming. But the fact that you have to tap 5 mana to turn this thing on, it would be better if it was a 4/4 with Trample instead of a 5/5 for only 4 mana instead of a 5/5 with Trample for 5 mana. It's really steep. It does give you the added benefit here of another creature, base power and toughness 3/3, but honestly, by the time you've turned this thing on, I find that it doesn't make too much of a difference. It can potentially buff Ouroboroid even higher, so if Ouroboroid already has a bunch of counters on it, then it will be a base creature 3/3, so then it's going to have an even higher power. You can put even more counters on all your stuff, and the Vinestock is going to have Trample, so it's going to be a big trampler, but still just, you know, playing a tapped land here, it's kind of like you might want to run like 1 less, not run the Heads Mage and then run a 2nd copy of the Vinestock, but is that Surveil a little bit more valuable than running the 2nd copy of the 5 mana thing that is really going to be 6 lands in total because you have to attack with, you know what I mean? I do feel like that Surveil can come in a little bit more handy than just waiting around to get your plethora of mana to turn this thing on. Even with the Gene Pollinator helping with tapping, it's just, you know, I'm only running 24 lands in this version because it's a very creature heavy deck, and waiting around for this, it just doesn't feel that good. Sanctuary is certainly really good though because it's going to get the buffs from Ouroboroid or whatever, and then because it has Vigilance, it can serve as a good blocker in addition to being a good attacker. Moving on to the sideboard. It took me a while to kind of figure this out, but I wanted to experiment a little bit with this version of the deck, so I tried some cheeky things in the sideboard that you might not expect. 2 copies of a Null. Again, it's really important to be able to interact in this deck in some way because it lacks interaction, and a Null is very good interaction if you're going up against BB Cauldron or you're going up against an artifact deck. It's also really good against the Pixie decks that run a lot of enchantments. 1 more copy of Into the Floodmaw. Again, I don't think running 4 copies is really all that valuable, including in the entire 75, but this could just be in the main deck potentially, and then you have 3 copies, and then you leave room for something else here on the sideboard. Disdainful Stroke, this is really good. Very effective against a lot of decks. Yuna, control decks, really, really good. Or any other decks that try to go really big. I think that most decks that have blue, you really should just run 1 copy of Disdainful Stroke in your sideboard. 2 copies of Negate, very good against control decks, very good against artifact decks as well. 1 copy of Tidebinder. This is one that could potentially be in the main deck. Like, you might not run the Larcenist and instead run 2 copies of Tidebinder. That could potentially also be good. That's kind of the role that Larcenist plays in the deck, is a similar role to Tidebinder, but it's not quite as good, but it is a flyer. So that's why I wanted to try it out in this deck list. There's also the potential of making room here for a second Tidebinder in the sideboard. I see some deck lists that are running 3 of this card. I don't think you want to do that. This card is really good, but I think having 3 copies in the total 75, you know, you could branch out to including some other things. Here's an interesting one. So 2 copies of Dragon Sniper. I wanted to try this out again because of the Gene Pollinator. So Dragon Sniper has Vigilance, and really because it has Death Touch, it's very unlikely to be blocked. And if you're putting counters on it with Ouroboroid or with Innkeeper's Talent, then this is just getting bigger and bigger, and your opponent's eventually going to have to block it. So you're going to take something with it. But truthfully, the best use of this card I found was when I'm on the draw, because now I can just play this turn 2, potentially even turn 1, and now I've just got the best blocker in the world. You know, Vigilance reads Death Touch. What more could you ask for in a blocker? Obviously, being a 1/1, it dies really easily. You know, if the opponent plays a Nova Hellkite, then it's not going to be able to block it anyway. But if you can get 1 counter on this thing, you know, just get it going a little bit, then it might stick around and it might prove to be valuable. It actually did perform really good in this deck, though, in all seriousness. I think that, again, if you're experimenting with Gene Pollinator in a deck, then you're probably going to want to consider including Dragon Sniper somewhere in the 75. Frenzied Baloth, this worked pretty well against control decks. That was the main reason why it's in here, is that it's a haster with trample, and then it also prevents all your other creatures from being countered. There were a couple situations where I included this in some other matchups that were running a lot of small creatures. Like, I actually went up against a kind of like tokens-based white deck, not quite the same as mono white tokens from before rotation, but somewhat similar. And this worked pretty well in that, because obviously you can just trample over all those 1/1 tokens. 2 copies of Heritage Reclamation. This card is just awesome. It's just really, really good in the current meta. I think you want certainly at least 1 copy in the 75. I would recommend 2 copies in the 75 if you're running a green deck. Basically the ultimate counter to VV Cauldron. You just put, no matter what, you put these 2 cards in when you're going up against VV Cauldron. Speaking of VV Cauldron, rounding out the 75 is 2 copies of Keen-Eyed Curator. This is really good. I typically put this in when I'm on the draw. Really easy to slot in with this deck. I can just cut a Floodpitch Drowner, cut a Plume-Creed Escort. I might cop the Innkeeper's Talents in some matchups, but the Innkeeper's Talent is good with the Keen-Eyed Curator, since it can potentially get trample if it exiles enough things. But yeah, it's very easy to slot this in. It's very good on the draw if you're going up against a deck that uses the graveyard. That rounds out version 1 of Simic counters. It's really good. I think it performed better than I was expecting. So now I'm going to move on to the gameplay, and then I'll see you back here for version number 2. All right, here's my opening hand for the first game of the first match, and this looks really good. Can potentially even get Enduring Curiosity down on turn 3 if my opponent doesn't remove Llanowar Elves. And I'm going up against Izzet Cauldron. So it's always intimidating going against this deck, obviously, but at least it'll be a good test to see how well this version of my Simic deck performs. I was wondering what to do here if my opponent attacks. I was thinking that blocking with the Elves actually might not be a bad trade, because the Mako is definitely something that can't be left unattended. It's just going to grow every single turn. And by doing that, I actually forced my opponent to play in a Braid, which I was very happy about. I ended up drawing a 4th land anyway for Enduring Curiosity. And now I can actually do some good stuff. I can play Floodpitch Drowner. The next turn I can play Innkeeper's Talent and hold up into the Floodmaw. VV is now in the graveyard, and that is quite scary. I'm going to tap down the Mako. So now I'm just thinking of running out this Innkeeper's Talent and then holding up Floodmaw, like I said. Can certainly attack into fear of missing out here. I don't mind the trade. Tapped land for my opponent, which is a good sign for me. But again, VV is in the graveyard. My opponent attacks with the fear of missing out. And I was just wondering if I want to bounce this. It's not a very good bounce target because it can be replayed and then you get to draw and discard again, or discard and draw again. With my opponent not playing anything, I was kind of debating using this into the Floodmaw. But at the same time, I was also trying to figure out what they were holding. It seemed like they might be holding their own into the Floodmaw. It also could just be a burn spell, like an Abrade or something like that. It could potentially be a Torch the Tower, but these decks haven't been running as many copies of Torch the Tower as they used to. I want to try to bait out whatever my opponent is doing. So I'm going to put the counter on Flood Pitch Drowner, see if they react. No reaction yet, and I'm going to attack. Still no reaction. So I decided not to play the Curiosity there because they were clearly holding something, and they would seemingly use it on my Curiosity or my Drowner, and then I would be tapped out, and I wouldn't be able to respond on their turn. So that's why I didn't play the Curiosity. I figured I could wait and maybe play it at the end of my opponent's turn if they tap out, and then I could still have mana up for Into the Floodmaw. So they play their Cauldron. VV is in the graveyard, but I can use my Into the Floodmaw in response, and then they don't have the mana to recast the Cauldron, at least seemingly. They haven't played a land yet. So that's what I'm going to do. So now VV seemingly is just going to be exiled. They do still get to put a counter on something. They put it on the Mako. And then that's it. So they didn't have the mana to recast Agatha's Soul Cauldron. So I have a few options here. I can at least play Llanowar Elves if I want. I can also plus up the Innkeeper's talent. So that's what I think I'm going to do first here to give my creature ward. And again, I'm trying to bait out their spell, whatever their spell they were holding was, and it was Into the Floodmaw. So I did successfully bait out the removal that they had. So now I don't think I'm going to play Enduring Curiosity, of course. There's not really a reason to. Certainly can at least play Llanowar Elves, though. And then I can hold Flood Pitch Drowner. But again, the turn before that, the reason why I didn't play Curiosity, I knew they were holding something, and then I would be tapped out. I wouldn't have been able to bounce that Agatha's Soul Cauldron, and then they could have had this crazy turn with +1/+1 counters and everything. So it was the right decision. They play a Tursa, which is not really that scary. The Mako is certainly going to get bigger, but seemingly they're just trying to find lands here. Discarding the Soul Cauldron. They actually had a land, so I'm surprised that they discarded that because they only have 3 lands here. That might have been a little bit greedy on my opponent's part, but they did draw an island anyway, an untapped land. So they're going to attack with the Tursa, and there's no reason for me to block here. Now I do have some options. I can put a +1/+1 counter on either the Drowner or the Elves, but I was actually thinking of just putting it on the Elves because the Elves can punch through the fear of missing out. So then seemingly they might not block this Elf if I attack with it, and then I can play Curiosity. At first they are deciding to block, but then they take it back. So now that they haven't blocked, I can play Curiosity, draw a card, and then I'll still have mana to activate this Drowner, which I am considering doing because that Mako has gotten kind of big, and this is going to get rid of all the +1/+1 counters on it, obviously. So it's a little bit strange, the sequencing that I've done here, but it does seem to be working for the most part. Unfortunately, I only have 2 lands in my hand. They play another Fear. And now they have Delirium, so this is getting somewhat scary. They play a Quantum Riddler and draw 2 cards as well. They're attacking with the Tursa, and they're attacking with the Fear missing out. So I at least have some decent blocks here, but they decide to take it back, and I think that's why, because I have the Curiosity, and I don't mind losing my Curiosity. It's going to come back, of course, and then they would just lose a creature. So I drew Ouroboroid, so now I can start getting busy. I can at least get my things kind of big here. And I'm going to order my triggers very specifically. I'm going to make sure that the talent triggers first, and then the Ouroboroid triggers second, so that now Ouroboroid has 2 power and everything gets 2+1/+1 counters. And now also everything has ward 1. The next turn, I can also level up the Innkeeper's talent again, and then all the ++1 counters are going to be doubled. So they play another Fear of Missing Out, but I'm at least getting really big creatures here. They play another Mako as well, so they're kind of going a little wide on me, which could be a little concerning. But I drew a second Ouroboroid, so now I can play this, I can shock my land in, and then I can activate the talent as well. So this is nuts. This is just... It doesn't matter how I order the triggers now, because look at this, every counter it's doubled. So it's absolutely nuts, the amount of power that I have on the board here. Now, I got a little excited, evidently, when this happened, and then I just hit the attack all button without really thinking. I shouldn't have actually attacked all, because look at this board that my opponent has. They can just block with the fish, block with the Mako, block with one of the other creatures, and then they still have a decent board. So it was a little reckless. I probably should have only attacked with like 2 of them, maybe, but I just got too excited having these big creatures. That being said, this is what I was explaining in the deck tech, how I don't have any trample. My opponent didn't really need to scoop there, but they did anyway. The game certainly wasn't over. They could have blocked, but I guess they just didn't really feel like playing it out. So Sentinel of Nameless City is not really that good on the draw, especially if you're going up against a deck that has a good amount of creatures. But certainly Tidebinder is a good counter to their deck, and Keen-Eyed Curator as well. So I can take out the Imagos. The Imagos aren't going to punch through the Steam Core Scholars that they have anyway. And I can put in the Keen-Eyed Curators. Trimming a Curiosity on the draw feels like a good choice, and then I can put in 2 Heritage Reclamations. Heritage Reclamation is a very strong counter to their deck. And then I'm also considering if I want to put in these Annuls. Dragon Sniper has also sometimes proven to be effective in this matchup for me, because it blocks any one of their creatures. Any one of their creatures that gets really big is going to be blocked and can be killed. I'm just kind of going through and considering all my options here. What I'm doing now is I'm sorting all of my pieces of interaction that could seemingly work against their deck. So the Larcenist, the Tidebinder, the Repulsive Mutation, these are all things that can potentially work against their deck. The Into the Flood mods can be a little weird against their deck, because if you get rid of one of their creatures, then a lot of their creatures have Enter the Battlefield effects, and that might not be an effect that you want to have trigger again. Cutting a Floodpit Drowner on the draw does feel like a good choice, because I can't play as aggressive, so I'm essentially using Floodpit Drowner as a way to tap down their creatures, instead of using it as a way to get ahead by tapping and then attacking. Putting the Plume back in felt like the right thing to do. I don't think I really should have taken... I think I should have actually probably left both in and maybe taken out another Drowner or something, or taken out a Spyglass Siren. This opening hand is not bad. It could be better, but I did decide to start with the Siren here, because I can use the Gene Pollinator. My opponent didn't play anything, and I drew my 3rd land, so I'm actually in pretty good shape now. Just wondering if I want to crack the map token, play the Gene Pollinator, or hold up a Floodpit Drowner, any of these options. Starting with the Vine Stalk felt like a good choice. I can play the Gene Pollinator and then just have more mana. I might also bait out a removal spell for them. And then on my next turn, I have a few options. I can play the Larcenist, I can play the Drowner and the Gene Pollinator. I can crack my map token. I can also just use my map token for mana. So I drew an Ouroboroid. I wasn't thinking that slamming this at this point was a good idea, because they have too much mana open. They're going to respond in some way. I was potentially thinking of not attacking with the Pollinator here, because I wanted to leave the mana open. So attacking with just the Siren felt like it made sense. can play another pollinator here. I didn't think it was necessary to hold up mana for both Blood Pitch Drowners. That's the other thing that I was kind of considering, but now I actually have access to even more mana with the second Gene Pollinator. I'm also, again, just trying to bait out a removal spell from my opponent here before I play some of my better creatures like the Larcenist and the Ouroboroid. So I got a Torch the Tower out. That's at least something. My opponent plays a Fear. They discarded a land. And they're still holding up removals, so I can at least play my Floodpitch Drowner. I'll be able to get in for an attack. But again, I'm really trying to bait out this removal from my opponent, and they're just not playing it. I drew an Annul, which is very good. So I'm definitely thinking of saving my mana up for that. And I'm without a doubt attacking with the Drowner. I'm just kind of wondering if I want to attack with the Pollinators as well. Again, I can tap the Drowner for mana because it has Vigilance. I decided to just get in with all here. There's no reason to play the Larcenist because my opponent doesn't have anything on the field that is good to be targeted with it for right now. And I can just hold up my other Drowner and my Annul. So there's Vivi, and this is potentially scary. But they only have one mana open. And I'm certainly going to cast this Floodpitch Drowner, but I'm kind of thinking of what I want to do with it. What I am considering here is actually playing the Larcenist on Vivi. And then they could potentially sack the Vivi because it will be a treasure token. But if they do that and then they play a Cauldron, I have the Annul to be able to counter it. So it's actually looking pretty good here. That's why I decided to tap down the Fear of Missing Out instead of Vivi, because I'm just going to make Vivi a treasure token here with the Larcenist. Also, since the Larcenist has Ward 1, they can't into the Floodmaw in it because they only have one mana open. They can actually sack the Vivi to return the Larcenist back to my hand to pay the ward, but then they're going to lose their Vivi, and then I have the Annul up in case they play a Cauldron. So this is actually all working pretty well. I do still just have the one, I can attack with everything. I do still have the one mana open for the Annul. It is a little bit risky to make Vivi a treasure token because you just gave them a way to sack it and put it in the graveyard. So that's where the Larcenist can be potentially a liability. In this scenario, though, it's okay because I have the Annul. But otherwise, it is a bit of a risk that you're running if you make the Vivi a treasure token. You are also technically giving them an extra piece of mana by using the Larcenist, which could be an issue. In this case, it doesn't really matter because my opponent has 6 lands anyway. So I have this Ouroboroid, but I technically don't need to play it because I actually have lethal this turn. So if my opponent has to respond, and then I can just hold up my Annul or play my Spyglass Siren or whatever. And my opponent actually didn't respond, so I won the game. Kind of interesting there. I'm not really sure if maybe they just didn't have anything, but still definitely worked fairly well against Izzet Cauldron. All right, so here is the second version of this deck that I want to showcase. And I think what I'll do is just go over the changes. I'm not going to really spend a lot of time discussing the cards that are the same as the last version. What I tried to do with this one was incorporate a bit more trample because the flying was great, but I was still having some trouble getting that damage through. So instead of just relying on flying, I wanted to see if I can incorporate some more trample. To that end, I took out the 2 Gene Pollinators and instead put in 2 Paw Patch Recruits. So it's not only a good 1-drop, but you have really good 1-drops in the form of Spyglass Siren and Llanowar Elves. It's much better as a 3-drop. And it does fit quite nicely in that 3-drop slot, since the deck doesn't really run too many 3-drops, at least not in this version. You kind of jump to the 4-drop slot instead. I do think Paw Patch works quite well in this deck, but not in necessarily every single matchup, because if your opponent's not really interacting with your stuff that much, then all you have is this 2-1 and this 1-1, which isn't really going to do all that much, right? It's nice that you have Tramplers that can get buffed with Ouroboroid, but that 1-1 is going to take a while before it can start slamming for damage, and same thing for what it's worth with even with the 2-1. Moving on to the 2-drop slot, there's quite a big change here. I took out the Imagos and instead put 2 Overprotects. +3/+3, Trample, Hexproof, and Indestructible. So this is a really good card to obviously target with Ouroboroid, because now if your opponent tries to remove Ouroboroid, they can't, and then not only that, it gets buffed, so now it has even higher power. It's going to put more counters on all your creatures, and then it also has Trample. It's just going to slam in for a bunch of damage. It really made a big difference. I think that for these decks where you get running Ouroboroid, I could see running 2 Overprotects in a lot of those deck lists. It was surprisingly super effective in a lot of cases. You could also potentially not run these Innkeeper's Talents and then just run the Imago in here and then have 8 2-drop creatures. That might also be pretty good. Next change was getting rid of the Larcenist and instead making room for 2 copies of Surak, the Elusive Hunter. This card is really good. Especially in this deck, it allows you to draw cards. Your opponent's definitely going to interact with your creatures in some way. It's got Trample. It can't be countered. Just really good. The only, I think, drawback about Surak is that he is a little bit easier to kill than like Sentinel of the Nameless City, and for what it's worth, even the Larcenist. The Larcenist has Ward 1. The Sentinel has a toughness of 4, and then Surak is just going to die to a Bargain Towards the Tower, dies to a Braid, dies to Scorching Dragonfire, all these things. But hey, at least you get a card out of it if all that happens. Last change in the main deck list was trimming 1 copy of Curiosity for a place of 1 more into the Flood Maw. The thing with Curiosity is that running 3 copies of this, 3 copies of Ouroboroid, I found that sometimes I did have these clunky hands and then I couldn't get to what I needed because I didn't have interaction, right? I'm not too sure about the extra copy of Into the Flood Maw, but I do think that running 2 copies of Enduring Curiosity feels a little bit better. The sideboard has just a few changes in here. Still have the annuls. I do have a 4th copy of Into the Flood Maw, and this is kind of why I was saying for the last version that you might not want to run 4 copies in the 75. It really didn't work as well as I was hoping. I did want to try it out. Really leaves much to be desired here to just keep bouncing things over and over and having no other way to respond to it. It feels like something else could go in this slot that would be more impactful, like maybe a second Tidebinder or something like that. Still have the strokes, still have the negates, but the change in here is that instead of the 2 Dragon Snipers, I decided to go a bit more reactive and put an Essence Scatter and a Flash Freeze. With the absence of the Gene Pollinator, that was just slightly less value that the Dragon Sniper was bringing because it had Vigilance and you could tap it for mana. But without that, it was like, I don't know. It might be better to just run these counter spells. Essence Scatter, really good because, again, the main thing that stops you are your opponent's creatures, right? So sometimes you don't necessarily care too much about the non-creature spells. The main thing is the board clear enough for you to get your big damage in? And the Flash Freeze was a really good addition because one of the toughest matchups for this deck was mono red, because the Screaming Nemesis can just sit there as a blocker and deal tons of damage to you or kill one of your things. Nova Hellkite, just, man, if you don't have counters on your flyers, it just gets in and wrecks them. And also these Sunspine links, I mean, we're not 3 colors here, but there's a lot of non-basic lands. You know, look, there's only 8 basics in here. So those are the changes for version 2, and now I'm going to move on to the gameplay. I'll see you back here for version 3. Alright, here's my opening hand for the first game of the second match. This looks pretty good. I've got plenty of things that I can do, and I can curve out pretty well. I typically like starting with the Spyglass Siren instead of Llanowar Elves because I can get in for damage with the Siren. And then I can choose if I want to hold up Floodpit's Drowner or play Llanowar Elves or whatever on my second turn. So I typically like starting with the Siren instead. My opponent plays a Bat. And they took my Ouroboroid, which, you know, I could potentially use Bushwhack to just kill this Bat. And if I plus up my Siren with the map token, then it will survive the fight. So I don't know if that was really the best way to go about it. It might have been better to just take the Bushwhack there, but that's what I'm going to try to do. And I hit a non-land card, so now my Siren can fight the Bat. I'm also debating if I want this into the Floodmaw. It is a way to interact with their stuff, so it seemed like not a bad idea since I have the Elves in my hand anyway, to have mana up for the Ouroboroid. My opponent plays a Quantum Riddler, which I was very surprised about. You know, this is seemingly a Dimir midrange deck, and those decks don't typically run Quantum Riddler. So that was a little bit surprising. Certainly going to run out the Elves here and then hold up my Into the Floodmaw and my Floodpitch Drowner, as well as my Repulsive Mutation, for that matter. My opponent plays a Sunset Saboteur, which I unfortunately cannot counter. And that was actually a good play from the opponent, because I can't really respond to it with Into the Floodmaw or Floodpitch Drowner either, because I'll have to discard a card. At the same time, it also buffs my creatures, which is actually kind of good for me, because if my opponent attacks with the Saboteur, then my creatures are going to get bigger, and I am a creature-based deck. So it's not necessarily that detrimental for me. Just wondering if I want to do anything here. It seemed like probably not, because again, if my opponent attacks with the Saboteur, my creatures are going to get bigger. Drawing Curiosity there did make this kind of interesting. I'm certainly going to attack with the Siren. My opponent's going to play their own Floodpitch Drowner. And I was kind of debating if I want to counter this with Repulsive Mutation. If I counter it, then I still have mana for my Floodpitch Drowner and also my Into the Floodmaw. The issue is that if I use the Repulsive Mutation, then I can't use it on something worse, like a Enduring Curiosity. I decided to let this resolve. And they're actually going to tap down my Elves. So in response, I'm going to play my Enduring Curiosity and then attack with my Siren. So that seemed like a pretty good use, or a pretty good response there. You know, I didn't think that playing my Floodpitch Drowner or holding up my Into the Floodmaw was really very good there with the Elves being tapped. So it felt better to draw the card and then potentially hit a land, and I did. My opponent's going to put a counter on my Elves and then hit me for 4. My opponent ninjutsus in Kaido after the Saboteur attacked, which was probably not a bad decision here. They can potentially draw a card, or they could tap down my Curiosity as well, or tap down my Siren. It seemed like they were looking for a land here, though. And they did hit it. So now they can replay their Saboteur. I drew a land as well. It is a tapped land, unfortunately, but I do still have some pretty decent options here. I am wondering if I want to play Ouroboroid here, but the Siren will not get strong enough to kill Kaido. That's what I was just checking there on the text. My Siren will only be a 3/3. I was also thinking that I can Floodpitch Drowner one of their creatures, and then Into the Floodmaw the other one, and then I can discard a card in response for the ward of the Sunset Saboteur. And then I can kill Kaido that way. So that's what I'm considering here. So I'm going to tap down the Floodpitch Drowner, because I don't want to return that to my opponent's hand. And then I'm going to target the Sunset Saboteur with the Floodmaw. And since I have another Repulsive Mutation coming up, I'm going to discard my Repulsive Mutation that I already have. Now I can kill Kaido with Curiosity and hit my opponent directly to draw that mutation. This felt like a good sequence. It was a little bit difficult to figure out, and I did have to discard a card, but I think I came out pretty positively from that exchange. So my opponent replays the Saboteur. I just drew a Llanowar Elves, which is nothing spectacular, but I can play Ouroboroid and then hold up Repulsive Mutation. My opponent's going to play a Tishana's Tidebinder, which was a very good answer, but I at least have an answer of my own in the form of the repulsive mutation. I didn't want to attack with Curiosity here. It would trade with Saboteur, but it just didn't feel like that good of value because it's just going to get much bigger next turn, and then that's potentially even more damage that I can hit with. I drew a land off the top, and I am thinking of shocking in this Llanowar Elves because Dimir Midrange doesn't really play any board wipes or anything, and now this is just another creature that could potentially get in for damage. My opponent plays a Sanctuary. And then my opponent plays the Quantum Riddler. And they scoop. So I think I sequenced that pretty well. I was a little bit patient when I needed to be, and then I just took some action when it seemed like I could address the biggest threat that was on the board. So now against Dimir Midrange, certainly the strongest cards are Enduring Curiosity and Kaido, so I'm just thinking about how I want to respond to that. They also do play a lot of creatures, so I'm kind of considering if I want to put in this Essence Scatter. Innkeeper's Talent didn't really feel that necessary here because my creatures are seemingly going to be bigger than theirs. Tidebinder is certainly a good option to put in. It shuts down their two most powerful cards. The other thing I'm considering here is if I want to put in the Annuls, but the only thing that Annul hits is Curiosity. Now that being said, I don't really have a good answer for Curiosity, but that would be the only thing that I'm putting it in for. This felt like all that was really necessary. I actually am kind of confident in the matchup here against Dimir Midrange because they play a lot of creatures, I play a lot of creatures, but my creatures are going to be bigger. Here's my opening hand for the second game, which doesn't look that great. 2 Surax, a Repulsive Mutation, which I can't really use until I get a creature on the field, and an Ouroboroid. At the same time, I wasn't sure if I was going to get anything that much better, and I am on the draw, so I could potentially find an earlier spell, because most of my spells are going to be less than 3 mana. I decided to mulligan it though. I really didn't have an answer to anything. This hand is much better. I have plenty of early game stuff. Now in this situation, I decided to start with the Elves instead of the Siren because my next land is going to come in tapped, and I wanted to leave the mana open for Essence Scatter and Floodpitch Drowner. My opponent's going to remove my Llanowar Elves anyway, but I wasn't too worried about that because Shoot the Sheriff is one of their best removal cards, so having it be wasted on Llanowar Elves is not really that detrimental. So now I'm just wondering if I want to play this tapped land to get it out of the way, or if I want to play the Verge to have up Essence Scatter and Floodpitch Drowner. I instead decided to hold up Essence Scatter and Floodpitch Drowner because if they play a Preacher right now, it's a really good target for Essence Scatter. Instead they play Duress. So there goes my Essence Scatter. It's still not too bad though because at least they're not playing a creature yet. And that's it. They missed a land drop. So now I'm just wondering if I want to run out this Floodpitch Drowner. I decided not to because it does answer a lot of things in their deck. So I'm only going to play the Siren though. And I decided to crack the map token just to try to find the 4th land since I have Curiosity, and I did get it. My opponent plays Quantum Riddler. Seems like they're running more than one copy of this card in their deck, and I really don't think it's a good fit for Dimir Midrange. Just checking if there's any removal or anything, and there was nothing at all, so I can just run out Curiosity. And I have 3 Floodpitch Drowners, which is not really that bad, actually. I can just kind of run these guys out and tap down my opponent's creatures, keep attacking. My opponent plays a Deep Cavern Bat, which isn't really a problem. Surprised that they took the Into the Flood Maw there. I think it would have been better to take one of my Drowners. Certainly going to tap down the bat. No reason to play the second Curiosity because I'm already going to draw 2 cards. This has been a very blue game so far for me. I've gotten pretty much nothing but blue here. Nothing from the opponent, which I was very surprised about. So since they played nothing and I have another Drowner, I figured just run out another Drowner, get in for some more damage, and tap down the bat again, or put another stun count on the bat, and So before anything, I just want to attack here before I decide what I'm going to do. Again, no reason to play the second Curiosity. I'm already drawing a bunch of cards. They play a Bitter Triumph on my Curiosity, which is fine. They discard another Quantum Riddler. And I drew a Repulsive Mutation, which is really good. So now whatever big scary thing they have, I can just respond to it. Certainly playing Sentinel seems like a good option here. And then I can leave up mana for Floodpitch Drowner, Mutation, and Into the Floodmaw. My opponent's deck does seem a little clunky with all these Riddlers. And my opponent scoops. So I think that matchup felt a little easier for me because it's not a typical Dimir mid-range deck list. But again, you're seeing how well this deck works together. Here is the third version of this deck, very different from the last two versions, and what I was trying to do with this one was incorporate even more trample than the last one. One of the ways I did that was making room for the Aloe Alchemist. So you can plot this thing, give something +3, +2, and trample, and then the creature itself is a 3/2 trampler for 2 mana. So you could just play this on turn 2 and now you have another trampler, or you could wait until you have Ouroboroid on the field and then give it that buff before the trigger happens at the start of combat. And now everything is going to get an additional 3 +1 counters, adding on to whatever Ouroboroid's power is when you cast that. One of the ways I made room for that was trimming a Plume-Creed Escort. But you'll also see that I'm not running any copies of Enduring Curiosity. So instead of that, I ran 4 copies of Surak. It's just really good, allows you to draw cards, draw through the deck, and really there's effectively 8 cards here that provide you some form of card advantage one way or another. Still have the Overprotects. I think that this card performed better than expected. And then the final change is 2 copies of Snakeskin Veil. So I have a bit of a protection package here between the Veil, the Overprotect, and then the Plume-Creed Escort. I just wanted to see how this went. You know, obviously Ouroboroid is a really important piece here, and having a few more ways to protect it is really good. I also wanted to try getting a little bit cheeky with it, because with Surak on the field, and even if Paw Patch is on the field, you know, if either of these are on the field, then they penalize your opponent for targeting one of your creatures. So I can let those triggers resolve, but then after that, I can protect my creature with the Snakeskin Veil. So that is just tons of value for me. I get a ++1 counter on creature, I get to draw a card, and then I still get to put a ++1 counter on my creature that's being targeted, and then that creature remains. The sideboard is unchanged from the last version. I do feel good about this sideboard, although I think that running the 4 Suraks was a bit too much because he is legendary, and I think I would have preferred to actually have one of these Tishanas in here. So 1 Tishana in here instead of the 4 Suraks, and then the second Tishana in the sideboard. While the sideboard is the same, the main deck list is quite different from the other 2 versions. So I'm going to move on to the gameplay, and then I will see you back here once that match has concluded. Here's my opening hand for the first game of the third match. This doesn't look that great. I really can't do that much. So, you know, having just an Elves and a Mutation really leaves much to be desired. This hand is definitely better. I have things that I can do. I'm just wondering if I want to get rid of a land or an Elves here. It seems like getting rid of the land is an okay option because I have the mana to Offspring the Paw Patch. And if I get rid of the Elves, then I could seemingly just limit my board presence. My opponent plays a Sunset Saboteur. I pretty much have no idea what deck I'm playing against so far. Just wondering what to do here. You know, I can play my Elves, but I decided just to Offspring the Paw Patch. I'll have 4 mana next turn to do other stuff. The Paw Patch is also a good counter to Sunset Saboteur because he's going to target one of my creatures when he attacks. My opponent plays a Nowhere to Run, so now I can put counters on things. I decided to put them on the remaining Rabbit. And my opponent's going to attack, which I was a little bit surprised about, so now I can put even more counters on my creatures. So definitely a little surprising there with I don't think attacking with the Saboteur was that good of an idea. Now I have plenty of options. I can play the Imago first, and then that Rabbit is going to have a base toughness of 3/3. Play the Imago, play the land, target the rabbit, and now I can get in for 6 damage. I was debating fighting the Saboteur because I could just discard my Llanowar Elves, but at the same time, I also kind of like having the Saboteur on the field because it targets one of my creatures when it attacks, and since I still have a rabbit, I'm going to get to put another +1/+1 counter on one of my creatures if the Saboteur attacks. So it actually didn't feel that necessary to remove it here. Instead, just get in for damage, and I can play my other elf, or I can just go find a land. I was thinking that if I don't play the elf, then the creatures that I have on the field are going to get even bigger, because now my opponent can just target the other elf that just came down, which is not really that great if my opponent attacks. But I think playing it was not a bad idea. You know, if I top decked an Ouroboroid here, right, I would just have a really strong board. So my opponent missed a land drop, unfortunately. So now I'm thinking that I can just plot this Alchemist. But I'm also wondering how I want to sequence this, because I can play the land to get the buff from the Imago. I am thinking that I want to buff this rabbit with something, either the Alchemist or the land, and then use the Alchemist on something else, which would probably be the Imago, but it could also be the stronger Llanowar Elves. So I'm going to put the plotted Alchemist on the rabbit. Again, I'm trying to see if I can bait out a response from my opponent here, and I didn't get anything, but I can play the Forest and then buff my Imago. I was also thinking that I can just potentially attack with everything here. I don't necessarily need the elves, and any one of my creatures will kill the Saboteur. My opponent plays a Sunpearl Kirin, going to get back the Nowhere to Run. So this is an Orzhov bounce deck, which is one that I'm very familiar with, of course. My opponent double blocks and goes down to 1 life. And my opponent concedes. So I'm playing against Orzhov Pixie, and certainly Into the Floodmaw does not seem that good because most of their creatures and permanents have Enter the Battlefield effects, so I don't want those to trigger again. I also decided to cut the Plume Creed because the Nowhere to Run gets rid of Hexproof. I was also debating cutting the Snakeskin Veil for that reason. That's why I was hovering over it, but it could potentially make one of my creatures too big that Nowhere to Run will not be able to remove it. Tidebinder is certainly a good card to put in because they have Cosmic Grand Zenith, which I definitely need to deal with. So for that reason, putting in Essence Scatter seems to make sense. I could potentially hold it for when Cosmic Grand Zenith seems to come down. And putting in a Heritage Reclamation also makes sense because I can destroy one of those enchantments before they can bounce it. Again, I'm just sorting by all the things that interact with their deck. This is actually a good amount of cards. Bushwhack still seems good to leave in because their creatures are seemingly going to be smaller before Cosmic Grand Zenith starts putting +1/+1 counters on everything. The other thing that I did here was I just put the 2 creatures to the side that penalize them for targeting my creatures. So I'm just trying to get a sense for how my deck measures up in this matchup. Here's my opening hand for the second game. This looks pretty good. Going to start with Elves here, of course. Can play Surak on turn 2, potentially. My opponent's going to use a Strategic Betrayal. Wasn't too disappointed with that, and I ended up drawing another Elves anyway. They're going to play another Strategic Betrayal, so I'm feeling pretty good that they're using their removal spells on just my Elves, but at the same time, I have no board state. My opponent's going to play a Momentum Breaker. So far they've had every single answer that they needed to what I was doing. And that's it. I'm out of creatures. But I can at least activate this Soulstone Sanctuary at the end of their turn. My opponent plays a Sunpearl Kieran. I'm going to Essence Scatter that because then they'll get back their Momentum Breaker and then I can't use my Soulstone Sanctuary. Then they're going to play an LG Acolyte. So I do think that countering the Sunpearl Kieran was a good choice there because, again, I have no board. So whatever creature I play is just going to be gone to Momentum Breaker. But obviously the LG Acolyte is a stronger creature. I can still potentially activate the Vine Stalk on my next turn. But this Acolyte is really strong in this matchup here if I don't have a board state. And really, the Strategic Betrayals on the Momentum Breakers were good options to put in because they don't target. So my opponent's going to play Cosmic Grand Zenith and seemingly double spell here. So that's what they do. I don't have anything in my hand for intimidation tactics, but now I'm just way behind. I drew an Imago, which is actually not bad. I can play this, and then when I play my land, I can make the Sanctuary a 6/6. So that's what I'm going to do. And then I just messed up here. I definitely wanted to target the Sanctuary, and then I actually paused. I was just like, wait a minute, I just did that wrong. I don't know. I just had a little bit of a brain fart. I didn't click the right thing. But I did want to target the Sanctuary. That is what I was thinking of doing. And then I could play this Bushwhack, but I'm just not sure of which creature I want to get rid of. Is the Acolyte worse, or is the Zenith worse? Seemingly the Zenith is worse, but they only have one card in their hand, so they might not be able to double spell on the next turn. And really, that Acolyte is going to be a bit of a problem, because not only does it have lifelink, but it's going to draw them some cards. So I decided to get rid of the Acolyte, and then I can at least block the Zenith and block the 1/1 token. And hopefully they can't double spell here. They play a Bitter Triumph on my Imago, and that's all they got. I did draw an Alchemist, which is not bad. I am wondering if I want to just save the mana up for the Vine Stalk, though, because I can block the Zenith with it, but I decided just to get in with the big Sanctuary. Made somewhat of a dent there, doing 6 damage, but my opponent's still at 21 life. Nowhere to run on my Sanctuary, unfortunately. All I drew was a land, but I can at least play this Alchemist for free, and then I can activate the Vine Stalk as a blocker. So my opponent actually attacks with the Zenith here. I think they might not have realized that I had this Vine Stalk in play, but I was also thinking they could have another Nowhere to run, and maybe they're planning to just kill my Vine Stalk, but I'm certainly going to activate it and go for the block. And the block does resolve, so I think that might have just been a small mistake on my opponent's part, not realizing that the Vine Stalk would be able to block the Zenith. And drawing a Tidebinder there is actually not bad, because I can use it on another Zenith. If they play that, I can use it on a trigger from a Pixie or a Kieran. They do play another Zenith, but that's all they got, seemingly. So it's not so bad. And I drew a Surak, which is also good. So now if they target one of my things, I'm going to be able to draw a card. They play an Unholy Annex, so that was very surprising. And honestly, when I saw this, I felt kind of proud because I wasn't. I mean, obviously, the Orzhov Pixie deck is one of my most successful videos that I put out, and I play Unholy Annex in that deck, and that was a big part of the video that I was explaining. So I'm not sure if Mr. Kamo here had seen my video or just came up with this idea on his own, but it was cool to see an Unholy Annex in a Pixie bounce deck. Kamo, I'm not sure if you watch my videos, but if you do, it was very cool to see that you're running a deck list similar to the one that I showcased. So now that being said, back to the game, I am still just going to hold up this Tidebinor. I unfortunately just drew a land. Now they get to Surveil, which is a big advantage for them because they have the Annex in play. So they're going to play a Sunpearl Kieran. I need to play this Tidebinor so that they don't double spell, but what I was hoping to save the Tidebinor for is when they activate the Ritual Chamber. But that's not... I can't afford to have them get back this Momentum Breaker, double spell, and sacrifice one of my creatures. So now I have no answer to the Ritual Chamber, unfortunately. Unfortunately, just drew a land. So this game is definitely slipping away from me. I think I did play pretty well, all things considered, up to this point, but it's just feeling like, man, there's probably no way I'm going to be able to come back from what my opponent's going to do on their next turn. My opponent opens up the chamber and there's nothing I can do. My opponent attacked with all for a second there, but I think they were just trying to pass by hitting the spacebar or something. So I don't have an answer for this demon. I don't have an answer for the Annex. I'm just in big trouble. And guess what? I just drew a land. So this game is pretty much over. Right? There's nothing I can do. They can just attack all, and then I'm going to lose 2 life off the Annex. I'm going to lose 6 life off the demon, and then 1 extra life from the tokens. So, and just to put salt in the wound, it's an LD Acolyte and a Nowhere to Run. And I just drew another land, so I really have nothing. So my opponent only attacked with the demon here, which if they attacked with everything, I would have just lost the game this turn. It doesn't actually matter because their board state is so much better than mine, but still they would have won on this turn if they attacked with everything. And I just drew another land, so that's definitely the end of that game. Not too... I think I did play pretty well, all things considered. I ended up flooding a little bit in that game. But still, it was very cool to see the Unholy Annex. So because I saw an Unholy Annex, now I'm going to put in another Heritage Reclamation. Previously, having only one seemed to make sense because those enchantments are only really a problem when they are about to be bounced. But now that there's an Unholy Annex, I need to have an answer for that. So that's why I put in the second copy of the Heritage. Now I'm just kind of wondering of what I want to take out to make room for it. Playing a negate didn't seem like a bad idea here. Again, the Unholy Annex is a real threat, and while the most powerful cards can, LD Acolyte and Cosmic Grand Zenith, those are very strong, but still the Annex is probably the biggest issue that I am facing here. And it also could just counter a Momentum Breaker and Nowhere to Run, any of those things. Again, just checking what my interaction is, and this does seem pretty good as a way to respond to my opponent's deck. But I was kind of feeling like I did want a Repulsive Mutation in here, so I'm just wondering if I want to make space for that. In the end, I decided not to. Just kind of run with what I have here. Here's my opening hand for the third game, and this does look pretty good, but I would have preferred to have had a Llanowar Elves or a third land. Still, it's certainly manageable. I have a Spyglass Siren to potentially find that land and also an Essence Scatter. Drawing a Surak is certainly not bad. I'm going to try to find that land, and I did find it. So I can play this Vinestalk here. I was also debating if I want to play one of these Paw Patches. I decided not to, because I would rather have the third land available in my next turn. Starting with an Intimidation Tactics, my opponent can choose whatever. They're seemingly going to take the Ouroboroid as my strongest card. And they had something else there, so I'm not really sure what they could be holding. It could be a Pixie. I didn't really need to shock that land in. I could have just played the Forest instead. Nowhere to Run, which is I don't mind that at all. I get to put 2 counters on my stuff. And I'm just wondering if I want to put all of the counters on the other rabbit or if I want to spread it out. I decided to spread it out. And then my opponent's going to pick up the Nowhere to Run with their Pixie. Still doing okay though, because I have a lot of things that I can do. I can play my Surak, I can play my other Paw Patch. I also don't necessarily mind attacking into this Pixie with my Spyglass Iron. I knew that my opponent was going to play the Nowhere to Run again, so now if I play, I essentially have 3 Paw Patches, right, that can all put counters on my stuff, and now they all have Trample. So that seemed like a good choice here, and then just play the Surak a little bit later after I've got all of the creatures that get bigger on the field. So playing Strategic Betrayal is a good play. I have to get rid of one of my rabbits. And then they didn't play the Nowhere to Run, which was, I mean, I get it because, you know, you want to wait on my turn, but I could be holding like a counter spell or something, right? So I'm going to put all the counters on my other Paw Patch. And now I actually have a pretty strong board against them. You know, I have 2 things that penalize them for targeting my stuff. So they're going to play another Pixie. And seemingly they're going to have to play this Nowhere to Run because otherwise my creatures are going to get too big. So drawing Ouroboroid there made this kind of interesting. I'm actually considering not playing it because my opponent can play the Nowhere to Run on it before the trigger resolves. And then the Paw Patch will trigger, but I can't put a target on Ouroboroid because Paw Patch, you have to put a counter on a creature other than that creature. So that's why I didn't play the Ouroboroid here. I knew it would just get removed with Nowhere to Run. And instead, seemingly my opponent's just going to play Nowhere to Run on one of these creatures anyway. So that's what happens. Nowhere to Run comes down, and now I can hold up the Heritage Reclamation as well if they try to pick it up again. See? So it says other than that creature. So that means the counter is going to go on Surak. I get to draw a card. I drew a Hedge Mage, which is not bad. And now I can hold up my Essence Scatter and my Heritage Reclamation. And it's another land. So I'm actually thinking of leaving this because then on my next turn, I can play Ouroboroid and then hold up Essence Scatter and Heritage Reclamation if they don't play something that I want to answer on this turn. They play a Sunpearl Kirin. Definitely seemingly playing Essence Scatter on that is not a bad choice. And my opponent's going to Bitter Triumph my Surak. So I get to draw the island. And now I know that I can play the Ouroboroid because it won't die to Nowhere to Run. And drawing the elves there actually made this kind of interesting because now I was wondering if I want to play the elves because the Ouroboroid won't die to Nowhere to Run, but it would die to Momentum Breaker or Strategic Betrayal. So that's why I decided to play the elves, just to have another sack outlet thing. My opponent plays a Sunpearl Kirin and picks up the Nowhere to Run. So I obviously could have targeted that with Heritage Reclamation to prevent my opponent from picking it up. That was the downside to playing the elves there. But again, Ouroboroid is still protected. I can sack the elves if I need to sack something, or it won't die to this Nowhere to Run. Now my opponent's going to play the Nowhere to Run, which is not a bad idea because now my creatures won't get bigger. And they did it in response to my Surak, which was also good because then I don't draw a card. But now I can just hold up this Heritage Reclamation. I can use the Bushwhack on one of these creatures, which I'm certainly thinking of doing. But that was the right thing to do, to play the elves there to protect Ouroboroid from a sack spell. So now I'm going to Bushwhack something here. I decided to Bushwhack the Kirin because if they play a Pixie, then they can't return the other Pixie. If they play a Pixie and Kirin's on the field, they can return the Kirin, right? So that's why I decided to get rid of the Kirin. Pixie cannot target a fairy, and Pixie's a Kirin, so it can't target it. Pixie's a fairy, so it can't target itself. They play an LG Acolyte, so this is going to give them another turn because I can't punch through enough damage here with the 4 lifelink. I do a Spyglass Iron though, which is really good. I can crack the map token on the Ouroboroid. I hit another Surak, so at least Ouroboroid gets bigger, but it didn't feel necessary to hold that Surak with one already on the field. He is legendary. So now everything's going to get big. And I'm just wondering if I want to attack with everything here, because they could double block something and then I would lose my Surak or my elves. But then I realized I was just doing the math that if they double block, then they actually lose because they have 4 life with the lifelink. So that's why I decided to attack with everything. That's what I'm just going through here with my mouse. I'm just checking the numbers that if they double block, you know, what are the consequences? So they can only do single blocks. No reason to not attack all here. So my opponent plays a land, and the last card in their hand is an exercise. So that is the game. Very interesting, and I was very glad to play against this opponent. It was very, very cool to see a deck very similar to the one that I posted, you know, the Orzhov Pixie deck. That is one of my favorite decks right now. So it was very cool to play against somebody who was using a similar deck. So I hope you enjoyed seeing the 3 different versions of the deck in action. There were some other versions of the deck that I tried, but I didn't include them in this video. I didn't really get very good footage, you know, not very inspiring matches or anything. The 3 versions that I showed do feel a bit dynamic. They're different from each other, and they do showcase some different directions that you could go. So I wanted to show some variety for you to be able to judge for yourself what do you think you want to do with this deck if this is something that you want to be brewing with. There are a couple of final points that I want to make here. So if you notice, in every single list that I showed in this video, I only ran 3 copies of Ouroboroid. There were other versions of the deck in which I ran 4. Even though Ouroboroid is arguably the most powerful card in this deck, 4 copies did feel like too much. A couple copies in your hand is seemingly great, but then when you're not drawing your earlier stuff, or when things aren't really working out the right way, and you're just holding this Ouroboroid, it's like, well, I don't want to just play this and have it get removed, right? It feels really important to put these other threats onto the battlefield first, and then wait to play Ouroboroid. The timing of Ouroboroid is really important. So I felt like I didn't really need the 4 copies. Really, if you're patient and you're good at using the resources that you have, then you're probably going to be able to get an Ouroboroid at some point. Surak allows you to draw your cards. The Siren, you can get a little bit of insight into the deck, looking through the deck a little bit with the map token. Another thing is that there is a creature that I didn't try in these versions that I showed, which is the Azure Beastbinder. This card does seem to be a good fit for this deck, and I think people are sleeping on it just a little bit. It is featured in some deck lists, it's even featured in some Dimir mid-range deck lists, but I think it can see more play in Standard right now because it seemingly can just turn off almost anything that your opponent has. Not only that, a 2/2 creature is much easier to remove than seemingly whatever else they have. It can die to a Torch the Tower, a Burst Lightning. It could even die to just a Stab or a Tragic Trajectory. Obviously, those aren't cards that you would play in this deck. I'm just saying that in general, that card does seem like it could see a lot more play than it currently is. I do think I should have used a version in this video that implemented that card, so maybe this is an archetype that I can return to in a future video. What I want to do now is actually go through and kind of make a final version of this deck based on the experimentation that I have done in all my other different versions. This is what I would suggest as a build after the things that I've learned. It has a good amount of trample, it has some flying, and it has some things to kind of work around the shortcomings that the deck has. Again, one of the pitfalls of this deck is that it doesn't have a lot of interaction, so that's why I think including at least 2 copies of the Beastbinder is good. Floodpit Drowner also does interact, but Beastbinder is a little bit better, I think. I also found that in that last version, even though I was running the Surak, I was kind of missing the Enduring Curiosity, you know, just being able to draw cards every single time your creature does damage to your opponent, especially if you have trample, is just really, really good. And again, 4 copies of Surak was definitely too many. I did have a few situations where I was holding this guy in my hand and I couldn't play it because I had one on the field already and he's legendary. So I think 1 copy of Tidebinder, I was sideboarding this in almost every single game, it felt like sometimes. So why not just have a copy of it in the main deck? The Plume Creeds I do think work very well, but I think the Alchemist is slightly better because it can buff Ouroboroid and give it trample, put more counters on all your things, and it itself does have trample. So instead of the Plume Creed, you have the Overprotect and 1 copy of Snakeskin Veil. You know, I do think the Overprotect is a little bit better than Snakeskin Veil, even though it's 2 mana, just again, because of that trample. It's so important. You know, if you have like 10, 15, 20 power on these creatures, but then you can't get in for damage, it doesn't mean anything, right? So what I'll do is I'm going to sort this by putting the core of the deck over here on the left. Similar to like some of my other builds, I'll put the core, the utility, and then the interaction. This is what I would consider to be the core of this deck. It's a little bit weird because, you know, not everything is 4 copies here, but, you know, certainly Siren and Elves, these feel really good. I think that there is a separate build where you can run a few copies of Gene Pollinator and then maybe you don't need the 4 copies of Elves, but as it is, 4 copies of Elves does feel really good. Paw Patch is just really freaking good in this deck because it does give counters on all your creatures, but again, you know, if you offspring it, there's a lot of good cards in the 3 mana slot, and having just a 1/1 and a 2/1 is not really that good, even though it does put ++1 counters on your creatures. It's not always good in every single matchup if your opponent chooses not to interact with you. The Imago is really good, but again, I was a little bit underwhelmed running like 3 or 4 copies of it. I think maybe you could potentially trim a Paw Patch and then play like a 3rd Imago. That could potentially be good. Surak is just awesome. I think this guy is a must include in this deck no matter what you're doing with these other creatures. I think absolutely run 3 copies of Surak, maybe 4, but then you run the risk of not having too many of him, right? And he's legendary. And of course, Ouroboroid. But again, I said what I said earlier, right, about running 3 copies instead of 4. The utility creatures are mostly blue, but I think they really do contribute a lot, especially Enduring Curiosity. Tiebinder definitely, you know, again, I sideboarded it in so many of my games. Floodpit Drowner is definitely good, and I think the Beastbinder really would potentially add a lot of value to this deck. If it can't be blocked and you're just getting with damage, but then it also just turns off your opponent's creatures or planeswalkers, artifacts, whatever. And again, the Alchemist, being able to give something trample, but it itself also has trample, it performed a little bit better than I was expecting. I think this is about as good as it's going to get for the interaction, at least for the first match in the main deck list. You know, there's good options here in the sideboard. You notice how I didn't change this sideboard in this final version. I think this sideboard is actually really good. And once you know what you're playing against, then you can choose, you know, do I want the Snakeskin Veil? Do I want the Floodpit Drowner, right? Do I want one of these other counter spells in place of the Repulsive Mutation? But I'm very confident in this sideboard for this deck. I think this is probably what you're going to be running, at least close to something like this. That wraps this one up. Definitely a different style of video for me here. You know, I don't normally showcase more than one version of a single deck, but I wanted to try something different. I wanted to add some variety to my channel and my deck techs. Let me know your thoughts down below. Did you like this style of video? Are you brewing with Simic yourself? Do you have any suggestions for cards that maybe I didn't include or that I didn't go over? If you enjoyed, then drop me a like to beat the YouTube algorithm. And if you are a fan of this kind of Magic the Gathering content that gets deep into deck building and card choices and card synergies, etc., then consider subscribing to the channel for more of the same. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.